The Biefeld-Brown effect is an anomalous physics principle at the heart of this story, and it also invites the most controversy. The basic experiment involves placing a neutral insulator, or dielectric, between two metal plates, one positively charged and the other negative. For greater thrust, the positive plate should be smaller than the negative plate. So the whole system is called an asymmetric capacitor because of the different plate sizes. When a high direct current in the megavolt range is applied to the system, the negative plate starts to chase the positive plate. This happens even if the positive plate is placed skywards. In other words, the negative to positive thrust seems to beat gravity. Many institutions and people have tried to either downplay or falsify Brown's experiments. For example, in 1990, the Air Force tested a Biefeld-Brown experiment in a vacuum, but they only used 19 kilovolts instead of the megavoltage Brown was using.
One of the things that seems to be a consistent theme through all of the various steps in Brown's life is the need for extremely high voltages at extremely low currents.
Besides using laughably low voltage, the other way people have historically written Brown off is by saying that the thrust created by the system is simply a product of ion wind pressure. But in 1956, Jacques Cornillon, a French Air Force officer and technical representative for one of France's largest aircraft companies, Sud-Ouest, facilitated Brown's experiments in a vacuum in the Montgolfier facility in Paris.
I think he was OSS. I think he was of French-Canadian heritage. His father was an antiques dealer named Louis out of Montreal.
Schatzkin actually met Jacques Cornillon in April of 2008 in Pennsylvania, right before he died. Still fully lucid, the 98-year-old French aerospace veteran confirmed the Montgolfier report's findings and the bizarre anomalous effect he witnessed with Brown's, an effect that flew in the face of conventional science.
The tests were very tricky. It was sensitive to so many things in vacuum. Finally, it worked. So that was a positive result.
As Brown said after the experiment himself, in short, it appears there is strong evidence that the Biefeld-Brown effect does exist in the negative to positive direction in a vacuum of at least 10 to the negative 6th torr. The residual thrust is several orders of magnitude larger than the remaining ambient ionization can account for. That's basically just a fancy way of reiterating that Brown believed he had figured out a possible link between electromagnetism and gravity, and that the thrusts he witnessed with his charged disks were far greater than what could be explained away by ionic wind.
The people in France are writing to Jacques and they're saying, we're inviting so-and-so to see a demonstration. Well, each of those demonstrations was a level higher, which indicates they're getting some reaction.
What types
they're
of
getting
people?
some Ministry of Science, General such and such. Last one was the French Atomic Energy, whatever their atomic energy name was.
But Jacques Cornillon and his French contemporaries are just the first of 5 incredibly reliable witnesses. The second reliable witness to Townsend Brown's experiments is Agnew Bonson, air conditioning magnate and anti-gravity and physics patron out of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
And Bonson writes in his notes that there's something going on here that we're unable to account for.
From a 1971 Australian intelligence memo often cited by UFO whistleblower David Grush, we basically now know that Bonson and his Institute of Field Physics at North Carolina Chapel Hill were just academic satellites of the CIA, tasked with studying anti-gravity.
Bonson talks about anomalous phenomena that happen when you get into extremely high voltages at extremely low currents.
While serving as a patron for Townsend Brown's experimental gravity work, Bonson holds the 1957 Chapel Hill Conference, the goal of which was to bring together the world's top theoretical physicists to understand gravity.
Which is a confluence of the two families, the Wittens and the DeWitts, with Feynman and Wheeler and all of these unbelievable characters in attendance.
Coincidentally, the whole conference is sponsored by Wright Airfield. That's right, what became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and the place that is perhaps the epicenter of all UFO mythology, starting with Roswell. As Eric Weinstein and others have noted, the Chapel Hill Conference ends up sending academic theoretical physics into a complete dead-end cul-de-sac by establishing quantum gravity, which leads to string theory, the Sisyphean academic framework that has basically led to no empirical results since the 70s.
String theory was a very odd development because it both allowed physics to proceed as if it was doing something new while breaking no new ground in the physical world in which we live. I don't really know. If you were trying to stagnate the field, string theory is pretty brilliant.
But why would you try to stagnate physics? Maybe because in the 40s and 50s, physics was leading to increasingly catastrophic death weapons. Maybe the physicists at Chapel Hill were engaging in self-sabotage with quantum gravity. Or maybe they were putting safety guardrails on academic physics. But perhaps the most fascinating clue to where the real vital off-the-books physics went is dropped by Eric Weinstein in a conversation he has with Joe Rogan about the Chapel Hill conference. He says that an Austrian mathematician named Hermann Bondi brings up positivity conditions placed on general relativity that may artificially exclude an anomalous anti-gravitic effect involving negative mass. In fact, I have the report from the 1957 Chapel Hill conference. It's called The Role of Gravitation in Physics, and there's even a chapter dedicated to Hermann Bondi's talk on negative mass and general relativity.
If you have two masses, in general, they always attract each other gravitationally. But what if somehow you had a different kind of mass that was negative, just like you could have negative and positive charges? Oddly, the negative mass is still attracted just the same way to the positive mass as if there was no difference. But the positive mass is always repelled. So you get this weird solution where the negative mass chases the positive mass, and they go off to unbounded acceleration.
Remember, in relativity, you have mass-energy equivalence, and if you just swap out mass and replace it with energy in what Weinstein is saying here, you have an exact description of Townsend-Brown's work.
The negative mass chases the positive mass.
The negative electrode moves toward the positive electrode.
So if you were to remove relativity's positivity conditions, you may provide a plausible theoretical framework for Townsend-Brown's work. And remember, Townsend-Brown was working with Bonson while the Chapel Hill conference was being held. And according to author Paul LaViolette, Brown was even at the conference. I can just picture the spooky renegade inventor popping into the conference and laughing at the high and mighty theoretical physicists groping in the dark at solutions for anti-gravity, while he's doing the real, vital experimental work in the back lab. Weinstein then goes on to say something that I find just as fascinating.
The highbrow version of this doesn't work, and the lowbrow version of this doesn't work so far as we know. The lowbrow version is called electrogravitics, gravidodynamics.
Electrogravitics was basically a term invented around Townsend-Brown's work. But how do we know the lowbrow applied version of anti-gravity, Townsend-Brown's electrogravitics, wasn't actually effective, yet strategically stigmatized because of its defense implications, especially if these artificial positivity conditions in general relativity are used to explain away other anomalous effects involving negative mass? My take here is that lowbrow terms like electrogravitics were basically used to stigmatize more vital, exciting, off-the-books physics. That way the public and academia wouldn't investigate it.
Does our government have a protocol to wield stigma as a tool for keeping its programs secret? Is the government a source?
Certainly there are parts of the government who consider that to be their job.
I'm friends with a SpaceX veteran, and he told me that when SpaceX was just starting out, Boeing and Lockheed Martin would always use the term rocket science to make rockets seem more esoteric than they were and to demotivate new entrants like SpaceX. Was the same thing basically going on with electrogravitics? The next credible witness of Townsend-Brown's work is a guy named Victor Bertrandius, a major general in the Air Force who helped negotiate the Japanese surrender in World War II and worked with Colonel Albert Boyd, who ran the Air Force's Flight Test Division at, again, Wright Airfield. Bertrandius paid an unannounced visit to a demo of Brown's gravitator at the Townsend-Brown Foundation in 1952. After witnessing the demo, he said, "Believe it or not, I saw a model of a flying saucer. I thought I should report it. There was a lot of objection to my getting in there by the party that took me, and the thing frightened me. Frightened me for the fact that it is being held or conducted by a private group. If it ever gets away, I say that it is in the stage in which atomic development was in the early days. The fourth credible witness is Paul Alfred Biefeld, the Ohio-based physicist who had studied alongside Einstein in the 20s. He came up with the idea for using capacitors in Brown's experiments.
He has a discussion with Biefeld about what might be an instrument for inducing a gravitational field if that could be done with electricity. And Biefeld says, I think it might be a capacitor. So that's the origin. That's why he calls it the Biefeld-Brown effect, because he's giving credit to Biefeld for that part of the inspiration.
But detractors like to claim that Brown and Biefeld never met.
You see a lot of people trying to play down his interactions with Robert Millikan at Caltech and then Paul Biefeld. They say he never met Paul Biefeld. And then this affidavit comes out later. Paul Biefeld definitely met Townsend Brown.
It's the first time we have an objective observer saying that there is some anomalous effect here that is unaccounted for in conventional known physics. And that document is signed by Paul Alfred Biefeld.
The final credible witness is none other than Edward Teller, the father of the American hydrogen bomb, who observed Brown's experiment at his home in Berkeley with Brown's daughter Linda and Teller's wife Augusta present. Teller was completely dumbstruck by Brown and his demo.
And he looks at it, and finally he said, I don't understand how it works.
And he says, I have no idea what makes this work. So there we are, we're in the realm of this anomalous electrical effect that no more a personage than Edward Teller couldn't understand.
And his wife tells Linda, who's Townsend's daughter, says, oh, you don't know how nice it is to hear him say that.
Exactly.
And then there's a 1943 FBI file on Brown that Shotskin has recently surfaced. It says that Brown knew more about radar detection than any individual in the US Navy. I'm not saying that competence in radar proves his gravity manipulation experiments worked, but I am saying that the idea that Brown was a failed hack quickly dissolves upon doing a little research.